Hi, everyone. Welcome back to my discussion of Chapter 3 of Long's 2015 book, Second Language Acquisition and Task-Based Language Teaching. Where we left off was to accept with Long that the older you get, the harder it is to learn a language. And in the overwhelming majority of cases, adult learners don't fully attain a second language if they start too late in life. And in the next part of the chapter, Long begins to explain why adults are, as he calls them, partly disabled language learners. So one theory is that when you learn your first language, your thinking becomes optimized for processing that language. So as we get older, this becomes entrenched, and your first language becomes like your brain's default settings. And so just to read some examples from the text, a classic example in first language acquisition is the initial ability of infants between the ages of 1 and 4 months to perceive the phonemic contrasts in any possible language, but their diminished capacity for the same task just a few months later when, by around 12 months, they only distinguish contrasts in their mother tongue. And so he's saying we start off being able to distinguish sounds in any language. And then as we learn our first language, then our brain, we become attuned to hearing only the distinctions in sound which exist in our first language. If you teach English, there are certain distinctions which your students might find difficult. So lice and rice for students who speak, whose first language is Japanese or Chinese. If their first language is Arabic, then park and bark. First language Korean, peel, feel. And if they speak Romance languages and many others, then sheep, ship. Also cheap, chip, seat, sit, sheet. Cheat, that one is for Thai speakers because they don't have a distinction between ch and sh that we have in English. So the point is that you may need to teach and practice these distinctions many times to almost rewire your brain to make the distinctions. And he has a quote here: once native phonemic categorization has taken place, it cannot be altered. And so even if you do learn a second language and you get used to new distinctions between sounds, your default settings are still your first language, according to this. I wonder how they could check that claim. It can't be by checking accent, because as we saw in the last episode, there are examples of people fully acquiring the accent of another language. But maybe it's just according to theory. And yeah, there are examples in other languages. So in Thai, there are words which essentially sound the same to a native English speaker, and you really have to pay attention to notice the differences. And I can hear them in isolated words, but in a sentence, I just have to guess from context which word it is. So the point is that because you are not attuned to phonemic distinctions which are not present in your first language, paying conscious attention to the sounds can help you learn to distinguish them. And this idea of conscious attention leads into Long's discussion of implicit and explicit learning. So what is implicit and explicit? In this context, implicit would be knowing how to say something. Explicit would be knowing that, so knowing about the language. So to give an example, so suppose that you've just arrived in class and you realize that you have not brought any pens with you, and you turn to your colleague and you say, "Have you got a pen?" So being there and knowing and being able to put those words together in your head and then say them to your colleague, that's knowing how. You may know that have you got is the second person interrogative of the present perfect have got, which is only present perfect in form, and it actually has a present meaning equivalent to do you have, and have is the auxiliary, and you is the subject. That's all explicit knowledge. That's all metalinguistic explicit knowledge. But you're not thinking about any of that. You're sitting there and the words come out of your mouth and you say the words with natural sounding pronunciation. implicit. That's knowing how. You can just do it. You may know that in the question, have you got a pen? Got and pen are the main stresses, and that there is elision of the T at the end of got, and that there are weak forms in the words have and explicit knowledge. You know how to choose the right expression for the context you're in. So informal, you know the person, it's a small request. English-speaking culture, so you know to say, have you got a pen, instead of please give me a pen, which would sound really weird in English. So again, that's implicit. You know that it is a request and that the literal meaning is different from the pragmatic meaning, because requests are often indirect in English and they're in the form of questions. You can see how different those two types of knowledge are. So most people never think about, they never focus on features of the form of the language that they're using. And in terms of how you learn, so implicit learning is that you just pick up the language. So you're just in a situation and you're around other people and they are saying things, and then you understand what they mean, and rarely do you consciously focus on the words, and rarely do you have a conscious memory of when you learned the expression, although of course we all have that in some cases. Whereas explicit, maybe there's a teacher writing on the board, have you got, and you're in a grammar lesson about how to use the structure have got, and maybe there's a translation into your first language, etc., etc. So Long, in this part of the chapter, Long observes that implicit learning seems to be the main way that we learn both our first and second language, even though adults are partly disabled when it comes to implicit learning of a second language. And this makes sense. So implicit learning is the default mode. It makes sense. If you think about any other skill, think about any skill that you have improved in. How easy is it for you to describe in words the improvement that you made? Or like think about when you learned to ride a bike and how you fell over it at first and then gradually you became able to balance. You were doing different actions with your body. In how much detail are you able to describe your acquisition of this skill? And it could be easier in some domains than others. So to give another example from language, Long gives the example of make a mistake. English speakers know that the correct phrase is make a mistake and not do a mistake. This is a collocation, and there are possibly hundreds of thousands of collocations in English, and we don't explicitly know all collocations. You just know the right phrase to use at the right time, but you couldn't possibly call all collocations to mind or even realize that it's a collocation. And a more basic point is that meanings don't live in words. And the information that we have about meaning in our language cannot possibly all be made explicit, because that would lead to a regress. As in, so I've got this sentence, and okay, please define this word in the sentence, and you have a definition, and okay, so please define every word in the definition. And so this elaboration of meaning in language has to connect to aspects of the real world, and you can't put all of it into words. Incidentally, this is also how dead languages are deciphered. That can only be done by trying to connect the words to something real in the world, such as place names. And from working out place names, then you might work out what the letters mean, and so on and so forth. And it's true that a dictionary, the dictionary gives meaning, tries to give the meaning of every word in a language. If you look up a word in the dictionary, then it doesn't. So first of all, it doesn't just give you the literal meaning. It also tells you something about how to use the word. And for you to benefit from reading a dictionary entry, you also need some knowledge of the world. So for example, if you look up a word and it says, use this word when you want to express anger, then you need to have a concept of anger. And implicitly, that invokes knowledge about psychology and relationships. So again, knowledge of language is mostly implicit. And Long is saying learning language is mostly implicit. And I think this is also why if you're in the language classroom, it's very dreary if your approach is to just stick with a text and just go through and check the meanings of words in a text or sentence by sentence and teach and translate sentence by sentence. It's much more helpful and interesting to connect the words to something real, because that's what gives you the real meaning of the words if it's in a real world scenario. So in the next section, he mentions Yup et al. Again, which annoys me. But the main point in this part is he's saying that if you take the most successful examples of people learning a new language in adulthood, there are tricky semantic contrasts that they're able to make. So there's an example, 9 subtypes of dummy subject constructions in Dutch. I think this is the study he was talking about. In English, a dummy subject would be it or there. So there is a phone on the table, or it is raining. But yeah, apparently in Dutch, there are 9 types. Long's point is just that there are certain subtle distinctions which must have been learned implicitly because they wouldn't have been taught. So there isn't a Dutch course which goes into these distinctions. And so that suggests that most learning is implicit rather than explicit. Okay, so in this part, Long is discussing studies into implicit and explicit learning, and he observes it's very hard to demonstrate implicit learning unambiguously. But so one attempt is Rebouchat and Williams, 2009. So in this study, English-speaking participants were exposed to sentences which had English words, but they followed the rules of German word order. They had 3 types of sentence, and they heard 40 examples of each type. So, for example, in the evening, ate Rose excellent dessert at a restaurant. Since his teacher criticism voiced, put Chris more effort into his homework. So they got these sentences, and then they were given a surprise test at the end with new sentences, some of which followed the patterns from the training phase, and some of which were not the same grammar and maybe incorrect word order. And the participants mostly correctly judged the grammar of the new sentences, but they couldn't really say why when you asked them. So they were applying rules which they apparently learned implicitly, and then they couldn't explain explicitly what they were doing. And this makes sense. So if, for example, if you are, for some reason, you are doing a Yoda impersonation, then you know how to change the word order to make yourself sound like Yoda without knowing that it's to study you must, object, subject, verb. I wonder if this really demonstrates implicit learning, because could it not be the case that is it not possible that you could notice a language pattern explicitly and then internalize it during the training phase, or internalize it during exposure, and then forget the explicit rule, but remember the implicit knowledge about how to apply the rule? I think that is true of my experiences learning languages, because I learned a lot of rules at university, and now I know how to say things, but I don't remember the rules. And Long also discusses the limitations of this study. So participants mainly gave wrong answers when they were asked to judge ungrammatical sentences. And I think there was evidence that they were just guessing if a sentence matches a training pattern. And he writes, moreover, the self-report data suggested they had focused on word order within clauses rather than the crucial issues of clause type and clause sequence. So perhaps this means that the participants were able to pick something up about German word order rules. Or with the more complex sentences, maybe they were just relying on guessing and hadn't really learned the rules. And this makes sense. So if you've ever tried to learn a language on Duolingo, so I tried to learn Dutch on Duolingo, and when it got to the stage of learning, I think it was learning negative forms and word order in certain types of sentence, and it kept giving me examples, and I just couldn't get it. And I think I needed to be given the rule explicitly. But anyway, so Long goes on to observe that certain things are best learned implicitly. So he gives the examples chunks and collocations, whereas explicit learning could be better for features of language which are less salient. So, for example, question forms can be quite difficult in English because, so in the question, what food do you think Yoda normally eats for breakfast? The object of the verb eats is disconnected from the verb because it's at the front of the question. And in other languages like Japanese, Thai, Chinese, the question word is in situ. So do you think normally Yoda eats food what for breakfast? So the answer would be Yoda eats, what does he eat? Yoda eats root leaf stew for breakfast. And so it follows the order of the answer. And final point about this study is that it may underestimate implicit learning because in the real world, people have much more exposure to language, much more chance to speak, and much more feedback. So the average German child probably hears hundreds, if not thousands, of sentences per day. So much longer exposure. And Long thinks that in first language acquisition, just learning in chunks through associative meaning might be the dominant learning method. So I'm home for the holidays now, and on the plane home, there was a child sitting across the aisle from me, and the plane was really busy, and the plane was really full. And I just heard her, and she was just looking out over, like looking out at all the seats, and she kept saying, "What a lot of people." And she clearly learned that. She clearly heard that somewhere, and she was applying that as a chunk to the new situation. Okay, so I'm just going to read a key passage from this section where he's summarizing what he said about implicit and explicit learning. While incidental and implicit learning remain the dominant default processes, their reduced power in adults indicates an advantage and possibly a necessity, still an open question, for facilitating intentional initial perception of new forms and form meaning connections, with instruction focus on form important, among other reasons, for bringing new items to learners' focal attention. Research may eventually show such priming of subsequent implicit processing of those forms in the input to be unnecessary. So just to stop reading. So he's saying, he's saying explicit instruction might be unnecessary. And then just to continue reading, even if that turns out to be the case, however, opportunities for intentional and explicit learning are likely to speed up acquisition, and so becomes a legitimate component of the theory of ISLA, where efficiency, not necessity and sufficiency is the criterion for inclusion. So in other words, he's saying, it might be true that it's possible to learn a language just implicitly, but if explicit instruction makes it easier, then we should be supporting that. Okay, and we're getting to his theory of second language acquisition. So in this part, he is trying to explain why explicit instruction is useful, because as we said before, Long is opposed to the skill building model of language learning. So he disagrees that you could be taught something explicitly and then proceduralize it through controlled practice, and then automatize it through communicative practice. So just to read another passage, intentional learning and explicit second language knowledge can facilitate implicit learning in other ways than skill building. Okay, because he disagrees with skill building. And so he's trying to explain, because he's acknowledged explicit learning is really helpful, but not because of skill building. So I'll continue reading. First, they can encourage selective attention to and either detection or noticing of linguistic features that might otherwise go undetected or unnoticed for a long time, perhaps even permanently, especially non-salient, non-meaning-bearing, communicatively redundant, complex, fragile features. And he gives an example. I'll continue reading. Second, they can facilitate noticing the gap, i.e. perceiving mismatches between native input and deviant learner output. Third, they can provide the basis for utterances, stretched output, whose processing aids development of implicit knowledge of the same rules or items. So I think he's saying you are taught something explicitly, so maybe you're given a sentence with have got, and then you're given maybe the translation into your language, or you are told it means do you have, and then you go out into the world and you're hearing examples of have got everywhere. And because you had that experience of someone explaining have you got, you're then primed to notice it in the real world. And then in brackets, he says, this is not the same as saying explicit knowledge becomes implicit through proceduralization and automatization. And that's a very important point. So I think he's saying that if you're taught something in the classroom explicitly, it doesn't matter how many gap fills you do after that. It will never be enough for you to internalize the rule. You have to go out into the world and start hearing the structure and using it in your communication while you are focused on a meaningful task and not on the words. Because if you're always just focused on the words, this is how people get fluency problems, because they're trying to think through every word explicitly and maybe translating in their head. And so they never get the words out because they never allow the implicit learning to take place. So that's a really fascinating point. Okay, and I think this bit is probably the best sentence of the book so far. What I claim is that explicit learning, not necessarily as a result of explicit instruction, involves a new form or form-meaning connection being held in short-term memory long enough for it to be processed, rehearsed, and an initial representation stored in long-term memory, thereafter altering the operation of the way additional exemplars of the item in the input are handled by the default implicit learning process. And so again, what he's saying is that the benefit of explicit learning is if you're able to learn and then remember just one example, and even just one word, and if you're able to remember it, then that will color the way you process examples of the word during your exposure to the language. And like we said before, part of the difficulty of learning a second language is that your brain's default settings are attuned to your first language. And so Long draws this analogy with setting a radio dial to a new frequency. The listener has to pay close attention to the initial crackling reception. Once the radio is tuned to the new frequency, he or she can sit back, relax, and listen to the broadcast with minimal effort. And so explicit instruction is like setting the radio dial of your mind to a new frequency. And another key passage, instruction is successful which recruits temporary episodes of explicit learning as an aid to subsequent implicit processing. I think it can also help people notice previously encountered examples of the new language. So have you ever been teaching a new structure or new vocabulary in a class, and there's a student who comes out with song lyrics containing the structure? So that's an example of something they've processed implicitly and maybe not fully understood, and then explicit instruction is kind of retroactively helping them to understand. And this theory makes sense intuitively because, so in my experience of learning languages, when I learn something in a classroom, it doesn't feel real until I've gone out and heard it being used by people around me. So I used to do Italian classes, and we learned all about the imperfect subjunctive, and I got it. I understood the point, but then I never had the confidence to use it outside of class until there was this moment where I heard a lady realizing that she'd been mistaken about something, and I just heard her say, "Oh, pensavo fosse lui." And that moment just gave me I remember that moment because I realized, oh, okay, people actually use it in this type of situation. And thereafter, I started to use it myself. So that makes sense. Okay, anyway, so Long is talking about explicit learning. He thinks it works best when rules are simple and categorical. That makes sense. I think there are certain types of grammatical rule which don't work very well when we try to teach them explicitly. So, for example, if you're trying to teach the difference between the present perfect simple and the present perfect continuous, grammars and course books tend to give a list of maybe 5, maybe 10 rules of thumb. which are helpful to some degree. But if the learning is only explicit, then I think it's quite hard to hold all of those rules in mind. And they also just don't fully capture the difference. Okay, so getting more of Long's theory. Explanation 5, attention is critical at 2 levels. So attention is the ability that a person has to concentrate on some things and filter out other things. And Long writes, attention is critical for learning at each of 2 levels on a continuum. First, it is an essential prerequisite for noticing, i.e. the moment when a learner's use of controlled focal attention at the level of conscious awareness results in perception, but not metalinguistic awareness, and not necessarily understanding of new forms and form-meaning connections in the input. So note that he says, but not metalinguistic awareness and not necessarily understanding. So noticing could even just be the thought of, that's an interesting word there, or, there's a pattern there, or, I don't know what he means by that. So even that is an example of this thing, noticing, which Long says is key to learning. Okay, so now we get E6. So now we get to Long's interaction hypothesis. So I'm going to read a passage from this part. The interaction hypothesis holds that important brief opportunities for attention to linguistic code features and for explicit learning to improve implicit input processing occur during negotiation for meaning. So when he says negotiation for meaning, that's when you're trying to communicate with someone about something and they don't get what you mean, and so you rephrase, or you don't get what they mean and you get them to repeat. And negotiation for meaning is thought to be, there's this thing called comprehensible output. And so the idea is that being in that situation where someone doesn't know what you mean and you're forced to rephrase what you're saying, that's thought to be a trigger for language acquisition, because it's forcing you to express yourself maybe more accurately or more precisely, or in a way which is more natural for the language that you're learning. And so we've got this example from McDonough 2005. The learner said, I think this is a real recording. The learner said, "What happened for the boat?" A native speaker says, "What?" And learner says, "What's wrong with the boat?" So I think the interaction hypothesis says that meaningful and real interaction pushes learners to produce more target-like, so more natural-sounding examples of the language, and then it also encourages them to test hypotheses about the language. And so, test hypotheses. So if you've ever been learning a language and you're not quite sure if this is the right word to use, and then you just try it, and then it either works or doesn't work, that can be a milestone in your learning. Another important part of interaction is that it's an opportunity to get feedback on your output. And the most common form of feedback is the recast. So that's just repeating what someone has said without the errors, or rephrasing what someone has said, maybe to clarify or to echo them. So people do that all the time. And so he writes, recasts are crucial points at which implicit and explicit learning converge in optimal ways. Information about the target language supplied implicitly, reactively in response to learner output has several potential advantages from a psycholinguistic perspective over the same information in non-contingent utterances, i.e. as positive evidence or models. So here he's saying, correcting someone is better than modeling the correct sentence. So they will learn more from you giving them negative feedback than them getting the correct model before they try using the language themselves. Okay, so why is that? I'll continue reading. Recasts convey needed information about the target language in context when interlocutors share a joint attentional focus and when the learner already has prior comprehension of at least part of the message. So he's saying, so the learner knows what he is trying to say. So understanding the meaning is already sorted out. And so they are primed to understand the new item or the new structure that you give them, because they know what they want to say. They just don't have the words for it. I'll continue reading. The learner is vested in the exchange as it is his or her message that is at stake, and so will probably be motivated and attending, conditions likely to induce intentional learning and facilitate noticing of any new information in the input. Yeah, so that's true if the learner wants to speak accurately. And to continue reading, the fact that the learner will already understand all or part of the interlocutor's response, because it's a reformulation of the learner's own, also means that he or she has additional freed up attentional resources that can be allocated to the form of the response. So in other words, the learner is not struggling to just to understand the sentence. The learner already understands because they understand their own message. Finally, the immediate contingency of recasts on deviant learner output means that the incorrect and correct utterances are juxtaposed, and quickly so, lessening the amount of working memory required for the comparison. This allows the learner to consider the two forms side by side, so to speak, and to observe the contrast, an opportunity not presented by non-contingent utterances, i.e. models. And so again, he's saying, it's better if you wait for the learner to speak and then go in and correct them. That's better than you stand at the front of the class and model a correct example and then put the students in pairs and get them talking and then listen in, by which time they may or may not remember the model. They may not make the connection between what they're saying and your model. So to put it in a nutshell, corrective recasts, negative evidence work better than models, positive evidence, because they can inform the learner not only that the form modeled in the recast is grammatical, but also crucially that their own form is ungrammatical, whereas models only serve the first function. And yeah, it makes sense theoretically, but I wonder how fun and motivating it would be for students. Is it always fun and motivating for students to be made to speak when they find it hard and they don't really have the words, and then you go in and show them everything that's wrong with what they're saying? And then he does later acknowledge the limitations of recasts. So if a linguistic item is not salient to learners, they might not notice the contrast between their utterance and your recast. So for lots of my learners, the final consonants are not really salient. There are also the problems of disrupting the flow of conversation, and then also just the difficulty of really hearing and processing the recast. So when I was learning Hebrew many years ago, I didn't know the difference between simcha and smecha, and I was walking around saying ani simcha, and there was someone who kept correcting me, and I thought that he was just correcting my pronunciation or my accent. I didn't realize that those were two completely different words, because one is the noun happiness and the other one is the feminine singular form of happy. That's the word I wanted. So he was giving me exactly the word I wanted, but the recast did not work because the difference was not salient enough for me to realize what the error was, and so I needed to notice that explicitly. Another example, I had a student who had the perfect opportunity to use the third conditional, and she didn't use it, and it was just a brief interaction, and I remember thinking, okay, if I recast this in the third conditional, she's not going to get it, because we would need to sit down for half an hour to help her think through the sentence, and also just to hear all the auxiliary verbs in the third conditional. So recasts are great, but they have their limitations. In the next section, Long is talking about individual differences between learners, and he's saying that a theory of SLA needs to account for the fact that learners with the same L1 and the same age might succeed in picking up a language to different degrees. Just to read another passage. In addition to explaining how adults achieve whatever they do in a second language, a minimally adequate theory, as noted, must also account both for differences among learners and within individuals. Differences at the level of linguistic features and constructions. A theory loses credibility if it can be shown that it applies to some learners and/or only to some linguistic domains. So, for example, some learners never learn to use the word don't, and so they say, I don't, instead of I don't have it, they say no have. And so you could attribute this to their first language. So Spanish speakers often have problems with negative forms in English. And so you could say, okay, well, they're not acquiring this point because of their L1. But then that doesn't account for the fact that that many Spanish native speakers do use negative forms correctly in English. So that doesn't work. So just focusing on differences with the L1 isn't good enough. And he also thinks there's this thing called the multiple effects principle. So that is focused on L1 transfer and also a second variable to be determined. So I guess that's just, that could be anything. So like motivation or anxiety, communicative need. And so he's saying it simply does not work for all learners or all structures, as failure occurs differentially at the level both of individuals with the same L1 and individual structures. It's a bit convoluted. I think he may be saying, so you take the person's L1 and then take any factor and keep them both constant. You will still find variation among learners who have that. So suppose it's the same L1 and then the same motivation level, or same L1 and same anxiety level. These variables, so attitude to the language or personality, extroversion, self-esteem, motivation, are, he thinks, on the whole, not that important. And then another factor that some people have said is important is sensitivity to negative feedback. So some factors which could help to explain individual differences are satisfaction of communicative needs, social psychological variables, sensitivity to feedback, and inability to notice mismatches between input and output. At this point, he brings up the case of Wes Schmidt, 1983. So Wes, he's quite a famous example in SLA research. So he was a youngish Japanese man who he was an artist, and he moved to Hawaii, I think, in his early 30s, and had very low level of English when he arrived. And then after a few years, he became a lot better at communicating and just dealing with situations, and also understanding things like films in English. But it was revealed in a series of monologues that he recorded that he did not improve his grammar very much. And he was someone who's really motivated to learn and had a positive attitude to the language and had constant, meaningful exposure to the language and never improved his grammar. So Long's view is that those factors are not enough in themselves to explain individual differences. So it's not the case that people with more motivation, better attitude, stronger communicative needs, that doesn't necessarily mean that they will be more successful at learning the language. And one thing about Wes is that he so although he was very sociable and very keen to talk to people in English, he had no interest in grammar. He had no interest in attending a grammar class. If you think about it in terms of what people are interested in, then I think it's not such a mystery, because, of course, if you are really interested in socializing with people, then you will improve your pragmatic competence in the language. And if you're really interested in speaking accurately and understanding the finer points and understanding subtle distinctions in the language, then you'll want to pay more attention to linguistic form. So it's just a question of what you're interested in. Anyway, though, but so Long is still trying to capture a factor that can explain individual differences. And so one idea is that being insensitive to negative feedback is an important factor. So if you're not sensitive, so if you don't notice when people correct you, then you're less likely to learn. But Long is critical of that. So he writes, insensitivity to negative feedback might work if it were only deviant structures that stabilized or fossilized, but native structures do too, and correct and incorrect rules and structures must be subject to the same mental processes. So that's a really good point. So you need to explain. So in other words, he's saying you need to explain both why people make mistakes and also how people learn the correct forms. And so he writes, accordingly, I have claimed elsewhere that given otherwise comparable abilities and learning opportunities, one factor, sensitivity to input, not to negative input only, is the most likely predictor of success and failure at the level of the individual. And so I think what he means by sensitivity to input is just being inclined to notice things about language. So to notice the features of a new language, or to notice the contrast between what you've said and what your interlocutor has said. So he thinks that a combination of input sensitivity and perceptual saliency can account for differences in success and failure in individuals. And yeah, it makes sense that these would be key factors. So input sensitivity it just means you're paying attention. You're paying attention to the language. And yes, if you're paying attention to something, then of course you will remember it better, you'll learn it better, you'll notice more things. I don't know why he thinks that's constant within the individual. I think that you can become more sensitive to input. You can become better at noticing things about language. Maybe it's just roughly constant within an individual. Yeah, I mean, it's almost obvious that this would help you learn. It almost goes without saying. So a final reflection on this chapter. So he has argued that most learning is implicit. There is a place for explicit instruction, but importantly, anything that's learned explicitly cannot become implicit learning through proceduralization. And in any case, the main way people learn languages is implicitly. And so think about what this means for language classes. I think that it means that most of the activity in a class needs to be focused on meaningful communication and not focused on aspects of form or aspects of the language. There should be short, sharp episodes of explicit clarification of a point and then lots of communicative practice. And that would seem to reflect the way languages are actually learned. So one question I have at this point, and maybe it will be clarified in later chapters, but one question I have is I wonder if what this means for the place of controlled practice. So does this mean that there is no place anymore for controlled practice? Because he's saying if you've grasped a point explicitly, then that's enough. And there isn't, because he doesn't think that there is a proceduralization phase. And so presumably you can go straight into the freer practice. And intuitively, that doesn't seem true, because I think controlled practice helps learners think through the new structure. But we will see what he says in a later chapter. And the next chapter is actually about the underpinnings of TBLT in the philosophy of education. So I look forward to seeing you there. Bye for now.